The Worm in the Font and Other Stories by Elowen Greaves. Read by Elspeth Sauer. Preface to the 1919 edition by Lionel Marchant, M.A., Oxford, lecturer in Sub-Roman Symbolism, St Jude's College, Cambridge. The present edition of the volume entitled The Worm in the Font and Other Stories is the first public reprinting of Dr. Elowen Greaves's curious collection since its obscure and limited publication in 1893. Only 213 copies were printed by Delbridge and Sons of Tavistock Row, and of those, fewer than 50 are known to survive, most of them inscribed in Dr. Greaves's own hand and deposited quietly into the personal libraries of scholars she deemed sympathetic. To some readers, the reissue of this volume may appear indulgent. Dr. Greaves's fiction never attained literary notoriety, and her name appears but sparingly in standard bibliographies of supernatural literature. Yet, it is my contention, as both an admirer of her academic work and a student of what might be called ecclesiastical dissonance, that The Worm in the Font deserves not only preservation, but careful attention. Greaves's reputation in scholarly circles was, during her lifetime, anchored in her painstaking surveys of post-conversion ritual architecture and her treatise on pre-Nicene symbolic drift in coastal parishes. That she also wrote fiction, quiet, eerie, and deeply informed by her research, was not so much a secret as a silence. Her stories are not collected legends. They are original compositions, though each emerges unmistakably from a bedrock of regional knowledge and a scholar's ear for texture and cadence. She walked the fields, leafed through the registers, and stood in the half-ruined chancels where her fictional voices speak. These are not romances dressed in antique garb. They are lived fictions, composed by one whose entire method of perception was steeped in the sediment of English religious memory. I do not suggest that her stories are real in the coarse sense, but I believe they reflect a truth, that the sacred landscape of England still groans with things older than canon and more patient than saints. If nothing else, this volume offers a glimpse into how a deeply rational mind may begin to notice the edges of that which does not wish to be seen. Let it be read slowly. Lionel Marchant, St Jude's College, Cambridge, October 1919. Author's Introduction by Dr. Elowen Greaves, FRHS, 1893. I am not, by inclination, a writer of fiction. My training is philological, my habit methodical, and the better portion of my working years has been spent in the company of ledgers, vellum, bone, and stone. My tools are ink, cord, wax rubbings, and a certain slowness of breath that comes from learning not to speak when the past is trying to whisper. And yet these stories came. I wrote them over the span of 12 years, never with a plan, never as a project. They emerged, sometimes whole, sometimes in fragments, during stays in damp inns, while pacing the aisles of ruined chancels, or after nights of half-sleep in rooms that should not have been as cold as they were. They are not tales of hauntings, precisely, nor are they moral fables. Some contain little action, others no firm resolution. But each was written because I felt something required it, a pressure behind the walls of rational description. Certain readers will ask what is true. I will tell you plainly. The stories are inventions, but the places are not. The tone of silence described in The Man Who Measured Silence is one I encountered at Liddington Convent in 1882. The font in the title story resides still in Swithering St Ealdwines, where I noticed a pattern of scratched runes below the waterline. Black Ewe, White Lamb is based on a funerary hymn carved, not printed, into the pages of a parish psalter at Ashcombe, each letter exact, each stroke hollowed slightly deeper than the rest of the page. What I did was take what I saw and write what it might mean if the world allowed meaning to go too far. These are not ghost stories. They are records of interruption, of what happens when the systems we trust to keep history tidy fail to contain what they're meant to guard against. I do not ask for belief, only attention. If you find yourself cold while reading, close the book and return to it later. If you hear your name in the space between paragraphs, do not answer. And if, after reading, you dream of water, do not speak of it aloud for 3 days. That, at least, is what I have learned. Elowen Greaves Lewis, Summer 1893. The worm in the font. It is often in the lesser churches of England, those damp, plain, long unvisited sanctuaries, that one encounters the quiet relics of an older faith. These are not the grand cathedrals, whose histories have been polished into polite narratives and recited for tourists. No, it is in the half-forgotten rural parishes that the past lingers most stubbornly. Such a place is Swithering St. Ealdwines, standing with a kind of exhausted dignity upon the shallow rise at the village's northern edge. I did not seek out the parish of Swithering. Rather, it presented itself to me through the indirect channels by which peculiarities often find their way to antiquarian hands. In September of 1880, I received a brief but curious letter from Mr. Edward Goring, an assistant archivist attached to the diocesan offices at Canterbury, with whom I had corresponded on matters of font typology. Enclosed was a copied excerpt from the vestry book of Swithering St. Ealdwines, written in the hand of the Reverend J. Latchmore in the spring of 1839. April 7th, baptism of infant Thomas W. Water drawn afresh, font drained and scrubbed thereafter by Mrs. Pell at my request. Child would not cease crying. Attending mother pale and without reason for it. Note, residue in basin, dark, unpleasant odour. Mr. Goring offered no speculation of his own, but remarked that several similar annotations from the same year existed in the same volume, and that I might find something of interest respecting the curious spiral carving of the Swithering font, of which a rubbing could not yet be secured due to recent weather. I had not previously visited Swithering, and the note, brief as it was, stirred my professional instincts. Fonts are among the most enduring and least modified of church fittings. Anomalies surrounding them, especially persistent ones, are rarely without interest. And so, in November of that year, I made my way into Kent to examine the matter directly. The train deposited me at Sibylhurst, where I hired a pony cart to carry me the remaining 7 miles to Swithering. The landscape was damp and low, the roads flanked with sodden fields and narrow hedgerows, stripped nearly bare. The air smelled of rotted leaves and distant peat smoke. I arrived as the daylight was failing. St. Ealdwines revealed itself as a modest structure of weathered stone, its nave squat and disproportionately long, with a bell-cote that leaned slightly to the west. The churchyard was sparsely populated. Only a few standing stones resisted the creeping moss and brambles. The caretaker, Mr. Finchett, met me at the lich gate. A man of advancing years and few words, he produced the heavy iron key from his coat pocket without ceremony. "You'll find it much as it's always been, miss," he said. "Don't get many visitors, not since the rail bypassed us." I thanked him and stepped inside. The air was cool and dry, carrying that faint mineral tang particular to old stone. Narrow lancet windows admitted little of the grey light, and my lantern cast long, nervous shadows along the pitted flagstones. The church bore no great ornamentation. The rude screen was plain oak, the altar unadorned. But the font was precisely as described. It stood somewhat apart from the nave's main axis, as though placed with careful reluctance. Hewn from a single block of pale limestone, its surface was weathered smooth, but for the single unbroken spiral that circled its outer face. The carving was crude, but deliberate, descending in steady coils toward the base, where it terminated just above a small drainage aperture. I circled it slowly, running my gloved hand along the groove. The spiral drew the eye downward, irresistibly, like water down a plug hole. As I made my way to the vestry to examine the parish registers, I found that time and the damp had not been kind to the old cupboard where the ledgers were kept. The drawers stuck fast in their runners, and the smell of mildew clung to the leather bindings. It was while prying open one warped drawer that I noticed a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tucked behind the ledgers, where it had evidently fallen or been concealed. Carefully unwrapping it, I discovered 6 loose pages, their edges stained and their ink faded to brown. The handwriting was small, sharp, and clearly feminine, a most uncommon presence in parish records. They bore no formal heading, but the text made plain they were written by a certain Mrs. Pell, identified elsewhere as housekeeper and keeper of keys to Reverend Latchmore. The entries were increasingly unsettled in tone. April 12th. Have tried to speak to the vicar, but he will not hear it. Says I fancy things. The child would not stop crying after baptism, nor the others. This week again residue in basin, slimy in the bowl like spit, or worse. Saw it wriggle, I swear it. April 20th. Would not touch it bare-handed. Took the brush, but it clung to the stone. He told me to pour gin in the basin, but I think it only angered it. May 3rd. Font drained twice, but the smell returns. I have seen it coil beneath the surface like a pale ribbon. The final entry, scrawled in an unsteady hand, read only, "It has teeth." I shook my head and abandoned the review of these ill-kept archives. Wishing to secure a precise study before the failing light grew too dim, I retrieved my rubbing papers and carefully laid them across the inner basin. The spiral's depth made the process awkward, but I managed to fix the sheet securely with brass clips, working methodically from the outer rim inward. The stone's surface, damp though it remained, took the charcoal cleanly, revealing the full design in stark relief. As I worked closer toward the centre, I found that my fingers, even through the gloves, could feel the faint depression I had noted earlier, smaller than a coin, but unmistakably worn by some persistent contact. There were grooves near the hollow which bore minute indentations, as though something had pressed irregularly into the soft limestone again and again. I secured the rubbing, rolled it tightly, and placed it into my case before the failing light made further study impractical. Only then did I allow myself to lean closer and inhale the sharp metallic odour rising faintly from the damp surface. It was then that I noticed, quite distinctly, an odour rising from the basin. It was not the expected must of damp stone, nor the earthy aroma of mildew. It was sharper, metallic, almost briny, with a faint sourness beneath it, something far older than neglect. I peered into the basin, lowering the lantern carefully to cast its glow upon the interior. The bottom of the font was not dry. A thin film of moisture clung to the stone. Not water exactly, but something thicker, faintly viscous, as though the surface tension had not fully broken. In the lamplight, it glistened faintly, catching hints of green and amber, like oil upon the surface of a stagnant pond. And there, at the very centre, precisely where the spiral's imagined descent would have ended, was a slight depression. It was not part of the original carving. Of that I was certain. Rather, it resembled the start of a hollow worn or pressed into the stone by some long-forgotten means. I felt, quite suddenly, the peculiar tightening of the chest that one experiences in the presence of some physical anomaly which the mind struggles to categorize. A hole where no hole ought to be is, after all, one of the simplest and most effective ways to unsettle the human reason. The stone around the depression bore minute scratches, radiating outward like the lines left by the hesitant scratching of some small creature, or of fingers. I withdrew from the font, drawing a breath through my mouth to escape the sharp tang rising from its depths. My mind was already turning toward the practical, to take a more detailed impression of the spiral, to measure the hollow, to consult the diocesan records for any mention of alterations or peculiarities associated with the font. But as I reached into my satchel for my rubbing papers, I noticed something curious. The lantern's reflection, cast upon the polished wetness of the basin's film, was not quite stable. The light seemed to tremble, not as a ripple upon water, but rather as though the stone itself shivered imperceptibly beneath the surface. It was at this moment that I became aware of the silence pressing in around me. The church, though small, should have offered the faint groan of timber or the occasional settling of masonry in the night air. Yet all was entirely still. The sensation that followed is one I will not easily describe. I felt, no, I knew, that something below my feet was aware of my presence, not as one is watched by a man peering from the gallery, nor as a fox studies its hunter from the underbrush, but in the manner of something vast and old, tasting faintly the disturbances upon the surface of its world. I stepped back from the font and closed the lid gently, feeling the faintest stick of suction as the wood settled back onto the stone. The spiral, hidden once more, seemed no less present for being concealed. The return to the village inn was, if not hurried, then certainly deliberate. The chill of the evening had deepened, and a thin mist clung to the hedgerows like soiled muslin. My driver had long since retired, and so I walked the lane alone beneath the dim gleam of a waning moon. At the inn, the Swan and Plover, a modest establishment, I found the fire burned low but steady, and the public room vacant. The landlord's daughter, a plain and silent girl of perhaps 17 years, left a plate of bread and cheese at my door, without knocking. I ate nothing. Instead, I spread my materials upon the narrow writing desk by the window and began my notes as I looked at archives I had borrowed for the evening and my rubbing. The local records provided little that was forthright. The parish register itself had clearly suffered excision. 2 pages, judging by the stitching, were missing entirely from the years 1840 to 1842. The vestry notes, however, offered fragments. Aside from the entries by Reverend Latchmore and Mrs. Pell's private notes, I found brief mentions scattered across later decades. References to families requesting baptisms be performed off-site. A clerk's remark in 1857 that infants of weak constitution fared poorly after christening, and one faint notation in a different hand entirely. No further burials adjoining the north wall permitted. Instruction from diocesan office. Later, when I would inquire discreetly among the villagers, I found that memories of the matter had grown vague, but not altogether absent. An elderly woman at the Swan and Plover recalled, in hushed tones, that in her mother's time, some lost their babes soon after the sprinkling. She crossed herself involuntarily while speaking. The curate, when I pressed gently on the matter, dismissed such concerns as superstitious relics of a regrettably unlettered generation. Yet he showed no eagerness to accompany me during my inspections. That evening, alone at my desk, I returned to my examination of the rubbing. The rubbing of the spiral was precise, though the charcoal had caught upon those faint radial scratches. I traced their arrangement carefully. 8 lines radiating outward from the central hollow, irregular but unmistakably deliberate. The longer I studied the impression, the more uneasy I became. The spiral, viewed in the flat abstraction of paper, took on an unsettling quality. It seemed no longer a decorative motif, but something suggestive of movement, a path not for the eye to follow, but for something else to travel. I set my pen down and stood, drawing the curtains slightly. The mist had thickened in the churchyard beyond. Even at this hour, I fancied I could make out the faint grey outline of St. Ealdwine's roofline against the dark. And as I looked, a curious certainty settled upon me, one I could neither explain nor easily dismiss. The font was not empty. The phrase impressed itself upon my mind as firmly as if spoken aloud. I tried to shake the thought. My years in fieldwork had shown me the power of suggestion, of the mind's habit of arranging patterns where none exist. Yet the sensation clung to me with quiet insistence. To distract myself, I drew forth my copy of the Ecclesiastical Gazetteer for Kent and searched again for Swithering. There was but one entry. Swithering St. Ealdwine's, nave rebuilt 1627, font of uncertain date, possibly Saxon, spiral carving unique in county, parish dissolved 1874, currently under stewardship of diocesan caretaker. There was nothing more, but as I closed the volume, a loose slip of paper that had attached to it, clearly a parish record I had inadvertently taken in my bag when I had packed so hurriedly at the church earlier that evening, fell upon the floor. It was a half-torn letter, addressed to no one, and unsigned. The writing was hurried, cramped, and faded with time. They will not speak of the children, but the font remembers. I have seen it once, only once, and never again will I look within. It is not water that sleeps there. It is not stone beneath the stone. God preserve us if it should stir. I stared at the slip for a long while, the silence of the room pressing against me like wool soaked in cold water. The candle flickered sharply once, though the window was closed, and somewhere in the distant churchyard, I fancied I heard the slow grind of stone against stone. The next day, I spent in my attempts to interview the locals and speak to the curate who was in the village for the day, and it consumed the entirety of my day. I did not make it back to the church that day, and retired early, finding myself blessed with a much better night's sleep than the one I had the day of my arrival. The following morning, I returned to the churchyard before sunrise. The air hung heavy with mist, curling around the gravestones like pale serpents, and the grass beneath my boots was slick with cold dew. My lantern's glow barely pierced the gloom ahead, the beam seeming to narrow as if reluctant to venture further. As I reached the lich gate, I caught sight of movement within the church itself, or rather, the absence of it. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, rocking gently on its swollen hinges. No light burned within. Mr. Finchett was nowhere to be seen. I paused only briefly before pushing the door wide. It gave a reluctant groan, and the darkness within seemed almost to inhale as I crossed the threshold. My footsteps echoed more sharply than they ought to have. The nave was still and bitterly cold. I swept the lantern's beam across the stone floor, half expecting to find evidence of intrusion, a broken latch, scattered papers, some mundane explanation, but nothing lay disturbed. And yet the air carried that same faint tang as before, metallic, briny, and subtly sour, like water drawn from a well too long abandoned. I approached the font. The lid was open. The heavy wooden cover, which had required both hands to lift the previous day, now rested neatly propped against the side of the basin. The stone within glistened wetly, though the night had been dry. A thin sheen of moisture ran in narrow rivulets along the spiral groove, as if something had risen within and drawn itself back down, leaving its residue behind. I hesitated, my pulse quickening against my better judgment. Then, slowly, I raised the lantern higher and leaned over the basin's edge to examine the hollow once more. It had changed. The central depression was deeper, more pronounced, its sides worn smoother as though by repeated contact with something soft and yielding, or something that moved. And for the first time, I heard it clearly. A faint, rhythmic sighing. It was not the wind. The windows remained sealed, the air unnervingly still. This was a sound that seemed to rise not from the nave, but from beneath the stone itself. A slow, wet inhalation, as though the font were breathing. I felt my stomach tighten with an instinct older than reason. I stepped back sharply, the lantern trembling in my grasp. A single drop of liquid slipped from the basin's lip and struck the flagstone at my feet. It hissed. A tiny plume of vapour rose from the stone where it landed, and the sharp, acrid scent of brine filled my nostrils. I turned away at once, the sickening certainty now rooted fully in my mind. There was something living beneath the font, and it was no creature of this world's ordinary making. I stumbled back into the nave, pulse hammering, my lantern swinging wild arcs across the darkened chancel. The familiar contours of the little church, the bare altar, the worm-eaten pews, the low arch leading to the vestry. All seemed subtly distorted, as though I looked upon them through rippled glass. There was a pressure in the air now, as though the very stones of the church strained outward, containing something restless beneath them. And as my breathing steadied, a new horror announced itself. The font was not silent. From within the basin, beneath the lid now leaning at its side, came a slow, deliberate scraping, like the distant drag of scales across rough stone, each pass rhythmically paced, unhurried, steady. I did not wait to hear it continue. Fumbling with my satchel, I hastily gathered my things. My instinct, honed by long years of studying the odd corners of antiquarian record, was clear. I had seen enough. Whatever ancient wrong nested beneath swithering St. Eldwines would not yield to my understanding. My duty was not to solve it, but to leave it undisturbed. As I turned to depart, my lantern's glow passed once more over the font. And there, upon the rim, something clung. A thin thread, translucent, wet, like the mucus trail of a slug, slowly retracting downward into the unseen hollow. It glistened faintly as it withdrew. The spiral, which I had once believed an innocent ornament, no longer appeared decorative to me. It was a mouth, drawn in stone, a feeding passage, a channel by which that thing below communicated with the upper air. I did not replace the lid. I could not bring myself to touch it again. Instead, I fled into the grey morning, leaving the door swinging open behind me. The mist outside had thickened, rolling in low bands across the graveyard, swallowing headstones one by one. As I crossed the threshold, I became acutely aware, though I dared not turn my head, that I was being watched. Not from the windows, not from the door. From beneath, from the earth. I reached the road with my breath tight in my chest, and the damp creeping up the hem of my coat. The village lay silent. No carts moved, no shutters opened, no footfalls disturbed the hour. Only the faintest toll of a distant bell, one, I believe, that no longer belonged to any working church, echoed through the mist. Back at the Swan and Plover, I found my host awake, poking feebly at the fire in the common room. He looked up at my sudden entrance, his face pale beneath his whiskers. "You've been out early, miss," he ventured, his voice thin. I nodded. Words felt strangely distant from me, as though they belonged to another business altogether. I ascended the narrow stairs without explanation and bolted my door behind me. At the desk, I spread out my notes again, though my hands trembled now and my thoughts came fractured, unbidden. The spiral rubbing stared up at me with new menace. It no longer appeared as a design, but as a track. A passage into depth, coiled not for ornament, but for containment. I retrieved the torn letter fragment once more, now fully legible under the strong morning light. The font remembers. It is not water that sleeps there. God preserve us, if it should stir. I realised then, with a kind of dreadful clarity, that these words had not been written in warning for any priest or parishioner. They were not meant for the church at all. They were meant for whoever might come later. For me. And yet the thing beneath had already stirred. It was not dormant, not fully. I sat for long minutes, staring at the letter, my mind drawn back through fragmentary recollections. The multiple notes in the vestry, about infants who screamed at baptism. The missing pages from the parish register. The odour of brine and iron. The movement beneath the stone. And I recalled, too, the curious phrasing in Mr. Finchett's reluctant account days earlier. Pell said odd things to the grocer, lost her pension, ran off to the coast. The coast, salt water. I felt cold to the marrow. It was not merely beneath this church, then. It had always been near water, drawn to it, perhaps, or born from it. Something that fed upon the rites performed above it, fed upon the sanctity poured unthinking into its basin. The font was not a vessel of protection. It was a mouth, a cunning trap laid at the entry point of faith itself. As the afternoon waned, a thin drizzle began to fall, turning the village lanes into dark ribbons of shining mud. I remained at my writing desk, unwilling to return to the church, unwilling even to approach the window. The very thought of standing once more within St. Ealdwine's nave filled me with a quiet, stubborn dread that I could not shake. Instead, I allowed my mind to work upon the problem by other means. I retrieved the old county visitation records from my satchel, leafing through their brittle pages for any mention of disturbances at Swithering. Buried amidst routine accounts of dilapidated thatch and absent rectors, I found this brief note from 1721. Font requires further examination. Irregular seepage persists despite repair of drainage stone. Parishioners uneasy. Unbaptised infants taken instead to Ferncombe. It was not much, but it was enough. The problem, it seemed, was not new. Again and again, across generations, the people of Swithering had quietly stepped around their church's deeper trouble, unwilling or unable to name it. The font remained, as it always had, and rites were resumed when the worst of its disturbances subsided. The creature, or force, beneath endured, undisturbed but not dormant. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion pressing against my temples, when a soft knock sounded at my door. I started violently. For a moment, I felt certain that no earthly hand could have produced it. But it was only Mr. Finchett. "Beg pardon, miss," he said, eyes low. "Thought I ought to tell you. A boy, Peter, the one who helps me with what caretaking there is around the church, took ill in a sudden fever the day before last. He passed not an hour ago. Never woke again." I swallowed. Did he speak? Finchett hesitated, his weathered face twisting in discomfort. Once, near the end, said, "It wanted singing." I stared at him. Singing? He nodded grimly, said it had been waiting for its name. The old man shifted uneasily and stepped back from my doorway as though ashamed. "They'll bury him in the North Field, miss," quietly. Then he was gone, and with his absence, a new terror unfolded in my mind. If the thing beneath the font sought baptismal rites, not for the children, but for itself, then each drop of holy water, each whispered name, each invocation given there had not sanctified the child. It had fed something, nourished it, strengthened it. And now, perhaps, it had grown bold enough to ask for more. I have never returned to Swithering. The notes, the rubbings, and what few fragments remain lie sealed in my private archive, untouched these several years. Yet even now, as I arrange these recollections, I find my gaze drawn often and unwillingly to the impression I took, the spiral fixed upon the page, as if it yet turns beneath the charcoal lines. The rites performed there summoned God, yes, but perhaps not the one whose name was spoken. Each invocation drew down into that hollow a presence that neither fled nor faded, and for whom each baptism offered a quiet nourishment beneath the stone. The font endures, the hollow endures, and beneath it, I believe, the listening has not ceased.